Hey everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with another flower in my summer botanical series, and this time it's the Plumeria or tropical frangipani flower. Now, I can't say I have any of these flowers growing in my Missouri garden, but I can say that the inspiration is somewhat came from my feelings here under quarantine. I felt somewhat isolated and on my own island, tropical island, if you will, and if anything will cheer me up, it's going to be this perfectly beautiful and striking flower. It's comprised completely of contoured royal icing transfers, all individually piped and then individually airbrushed and pieced together. And while it only has 5 pieces to the flower itself and might seem simple, it's actually a relatively complex construction. Unlike my dogwood, which I did for my spring series, which had 4 petals and a very defined center, this one has 5 petals, but they all join together without a clear center. Now that center is handy because it can conceal the icing where they come together. But because I don't have it on this one, the icing application has to be just so that the flower looks impeccable and perfect as it does in real life. Simple piping techniques to get to the construction, but the construction's a little tricky. However, the good news is this video will guide you through all the steps you need to get a clean, perfect construction. And if you want to start with a simpler flower, of course, there's the dogwood in my spring series. So before we get into talking about what we'll need, just a couple of words. A thank you, first of all, to Manu, who's a contributor to my site Cookie Connection. She wrote an inspirational water lily tutorial, a flower constructed in much the same way. And that became sort of my guiding inspiration for this whole series. It motivated me to see how many different flowers could be made with this technique. I've imposed my own unique airbrushing aspect to it to give color and dimension to the flowers, so you'll see that twist on these cookies as well. Also, big announcement, I joined the SuperPeer platform. This is an opportunity for us to connect, get off our own little personal islands, and talk more. If you have questions that aren't answered in this video or any other video, or if you attended a prior in-person cookie decorating class and have follow-up questions that might require more than a simple yes or no or one-sentence answer, this is your opportunity to connect with me for 30 or 60-minute consultations. There is a small fee for these consultations, but all that information can be found in the video description and a link to the SuperPeer platform. I hope you'll join me there. One other addition to this video is we're going to be exploring the difference between mesh stencils and traditional acetate stencils. They're very different animals. They both serve different purposes, and we'll be learning a bit about that as we go through the decorating of the background of this cookie. So let's first see where we're headed, and then we'll come back to talking about what we need for this project. So this is just one example of how the cookie might come together. I typically always put 2 big flowers on it, one at the top, somewhere along the spray, and another one at the base of the spray, because one of those petals is conveniently concealing a seam between the stem and the spray. In this video, I'll probably put together a simpler cookie, a single spray, as opposed to having 2 stems on it, but we'll see where we get. So what do we need for this project? You'll need an iced cookie or 2. We're stenciling on it, so ideally the icing should be dry all the way through. These are about 4-inch cookies. We have a fair bit to put on the cookie, so having ample space to arrange is nice. I always like to work with templates, if not the real flower, to give me a visual guide for what I'm doing. With templates, if I'm using them as tracing guides, which I will for the petals and leaves here, I like to have planar or top-down views that give me, the complete view of the petal, not some truncated or side view of it. And that will give me the best shape, and then I can shape it further once it's piped by wrapping it around tubes or setting them inside tubes. In this case, we're going to be wrapping most everything around a tube, so everything curves backwards. To do that, we'll be piping on different mediums, either parchment paper or acetate, and I'll describe the benefits of one versus the other as we go through the shoot. We need a little tape to adhere those acetate or parchment paper sheets to the tubes, and a couple of piping tips. I typically use parchment cones throughout most of this, but I will be using a round Wilton tip. I want the stems to be a very consistent width across every cookie, and sometimes that's hard to achieve with a cone if I have to refill it. So that's why I'm relying on a tip here. It's not a necessity. And I'll be using a smaller one for the little spray at the top that the flowers actually bloom out of. Now, I said everything on here was royal icing, and I kind of misquoted a little bit. The little tiny buds are actually fondant. I tried doing them with my royal icing putty, which is a very, very thick royal icing, just twisting them into tight little buds, which is characteristic of this particular flower. But I found I got a cleaner look with fondant. So we're going to use a teeny bit of fondant for those tiny little buds, twisting it into a tight little shape. Now, the background of the cookie needs to be decorated as well once we create all of the leaves and petals to go on top. And I'm going to be doing that with this big purple mesh stencil. We'll be talking about the differences between this mesh stencil and a typical acetate stencil. This is a stencil from one of my recently released tropical sets, which I use in another video. I use it in my hibiscus flower video, and I'll be using it also to show how these sets are used. But they look kind of similar, but they do different things, and they each have their benefits and drawbacks. To hold the stencil in place, we'll use a stencil frame or stencil genie, created by my good friend Ginny at Creative Cookier. And of course, we need color on this cookie. I don't have all the colorings out. We're both airbrushing and tinting some of the underlying petals and leaves. I always like to tint them very lightly or not at all, just so there's a lighter underlying color. And then I apply all my shading and dimension through darker versions of those colors in airbrush colorings. So airbrush coloring wise, I'm looking at my cheat sheet. I have about 6 to 7 airbrush colors that we're going to be using, 7 depending on whether we do a certain leaf, and about 4 or 5 regular icing colors in different consistencies, but all of those things will also be itemized in the video description. We have to do a little painting of the centers of the flowers. We'll be doing that with orange airbrush coloring and a teeny little brush. And I also want to add additional detail to these leaves, not just airbrush them, but also paint them. So I'll be using a small fan brush to apply really fine veins to them. And of course, you'll need an airbrush system for all the airbrushing. I like to have a single airbrush for every color. We've got so many colors that saves a lot of time in cleaning airbrushes. Obviously, that's an investment you may not want to make at this point if you're not doing a lot of multicolor airbrushing, but it does pay back rather quickly, and I encourage you to see my video on that topic. It's well worth the investment if you're going to be doing a lot of colors on cookies going forward. So I think that covers it. I'll introduce all the icings and airbrush colorings more clearly as we get into the video. In this section, we'll be creating 6 elements that comprise the entirety of the cookie on top. 5 of them are piped and 1's made of fondant. Starting with the floral elements, we've got bigger petals, which are actually quite tiny. They're about 1/2 inch. For the fully open flower, we've got more shaped petals for the emerging buds or opening flowers. And we've got teeny tiny wound up buds, which will be done with fondant. Then for the green leaf elements, we've got Plumeria leaves, stems, and the little sprays to which all the flowers and buds attach. I'm going to start with the floral elements. They're all done in similar shades of icing. You can use either white or a pale pink if you want a little more color on your cookie. I actually used an electric purple by Americolor that looks very pink, very pale shade. I also used white on some of the cookies that you'll see scrolling overhead. We are airbrushing them, so the underlying color isn't too crucial other than that it be very pale. Plumeria are typically white, but they come in also other shades. So I'm trying to represent the full spectrum of color here. Okay, so let's start first on the big petals that form the basis of the big flower. This is how they're going to start. Kind of simple teardrop shape with a line going up the side. And I actually tried curving these up, but the icing wanted to cave in. So I ended up, rather than curving the edge up, just piping a little line of icing along the edge to simulate the curve. It was a better shape. So once it's dry, I'll get airbrushed in 3 colors to look something like that, and we'll need 5 of them. Now, you could pipe these on either acetate or parchment paper. Either will work for this relatively sturdy piece. The advantage of acetate is it's much easier to see through, to trace. It's also much easier to actually tape to what we're going to shape it around and have it stick. The disadvantage is it's harder to get the petal off. Okay, the first step is to lay down that acetate on the template. Then we're going to outline and flood with the same thick flooding consistency icing. The thicker the icing is, the less likely it is to drip off the tube when we wrap it. I'm also going to demonstrate what not to do, which is to lay that little curvy line or the line that's to indicate the curve on the petal first, because you'll notice when I wrap it around the tube, it virtually disappears into the flooding icing. To wrap, we do want to wrap perpendicular to the 1-inch tube so we get a lot of curve on this, but we want to make sure that we actually pipe the line that simulates the curl on the Plumeria flower last, after it's wrapped, like so. And for that, I'm using a slightly thicker icing. I'm going to just touch down with my trussing needle at the end to tap that end into the flooding icing and then clean off the end, like so. And that completes the petal. You'll need to do 5. When they're completely dry, generally overnight, you want to remove them. This one is already removed, but to remove from acetate, you want to carefully peel away from the tip of the petal so you don't break it. Don't pull on the icing itself, or you could also break it. Now we're moving on to the petals for the buds. It's a must to pipe these on parchment paper because we're folding them. And I found that when I did this on acetate and folded them, the icing collapsed for some reason. I think it's because they dry faster on more breathable parchment paper. So for the more open petals, we're going to just pinch down the bottom end so it's very pleated. These would be petals that would go on the outside of the bud and set it aside to dry. And we want to also create some even more folded petals to form the interior of buds. So again, we're just outlining and flooding with that same thick flooding consistency icing, cleaning it up a little bit, and now we're pinching down instead of on just one end, on both ends. And I'm going to tape down those ends with a little painter's tape to make sure they don't flop open as they dry. Again, you want to do anywhere from 2 to 5 such petals for the Plumeria buds. So if you look at actual Plumeria, they have tight, twisty little buds like this. I tried doing this with my royal icing putty, which is very, very thick icing, and it looked okay, but I got a much cleaner result with fondant, so we're going to use that. You could use a pale purple fondant or white. We're just going to be airbrushing them for additional color and dimension with a little bit of electric purple. But either will work, and I'm just going to keep it simple and use white. So I start by pinching off a little bit of fondant and then rolling it between my hands into a thin taper, and then rolling it back on itself and twisting it like so. Then rolling it again just to even out that twist. Actually, I didn't like that one, so let me try it again. Twisting it once again, and I'm going to just cut off the excess there and then roll it one more time to give it a gentle taper at the bottom. That looks pretty darn good. When I'm finished, I just drop it off to the side on parchment paper to dry. Now for the big stem that sits at the base of the spray or stemlets, I'm using a Wilton No. 5 tip and the exact same icing used before, the outlining consistency in a light avocado green color. I'm piping on a curl of parchment paper pulled directly from the roll. I'll tape it down during piping so it won't interfere with the piping, but we'll release it at the end to give the stem a little bit of curl. For the most part, however, I'm piping in the trough of the paper so that the stem doesn't get too curvy. If it's too curvy, it won't make contact with the stemlet that we piped in the last step. Now for the top spray of the Plumeria, the small stems, I'm using a thick outlining consistency and a No. 1 Wilton tip. We want this to be very, very delicate, and it's a must to pipe on parchment paper. This piece is so delicate that if I were to pipe it on acetate, it would likely break trying to get it off. Now I purposely created one stemlet that extends out to the left at a distance from the other 4 because I'm going to be putting a larger flower around that. The rest will have buds, and I need space for that large flower. Just clean up the bottom here, the intersection point, and make it as neat as possible with your trussing needle. And then we're going to wrap that again over a tube to give it more dimension. In this case, I'm wrapping it over about a 1.5 to 1 3/4 inch tube, but all the dimensions will be in the video description. Tape it down well. Again, parchment paper sticks less well to these tubes, so you want to tape it all over so it doesn't pop up and break. When it's dry, ideally overnight or even shorter, these pieces will literally pop off the parchment with a gentle nudge, so be very careful that you don't break them. So for the Plumeria petals, I used everything from big fat ones to small slender ones. I ended up relying more on these smaller slender ones because they just look more elegant, and these have a tendency to kind of sink in the middle once wrapped. You want to make sure you get multiple directions going, so sometimes I just flip this over and pick up the reverse image if it's angled off to one side. But these are pretty symmetrical leaves for the most part. I'm going to pick up one here off of this side. And I am using acetate here just because it's easier to see through, and these are pretty chunky pieces that will come off, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to do this size here, and then we'll do an even smaller one. So again, the process here is very similar to what I did for the leaves, using a thick flooding consistency icing to both outline and flood. I'm using a light green because we're going to be adding more color when we airbrush. Just cleaning up that point so it's nice and precise with the tip of my trussing needle, and then I'm wrapping it over a large tube. Again, all the dimensions for the tubes will be in the video description. It's important to wrap these leaves in various directions, so there's some interest on the final cookie. You can wrap them perpendicular or sideways, left to right. And again, so that the vein is distinct, we want to lay it with a slightly thicker outlining consistency icing after the piece is on the tube. I pipe a gentle arc. I don't go straight through the center. That just makes the leaf look a little more graceful. Clean up that point and set it aside to dry. Now I'm going to do a smaller one and show you what not to do with the central vein. Again, outlining and flooding. This time I'm going to pipe it first. And you'll see as I wrap it around the tube, just as we did with the petals, that it virtually disappears. So if you want the overpipe details to be visible, you want to pipe them afterwards. If you want them to recede like this and be very faint, pipe them first. I like them more prominent for this particular project, like on the larger leaf that you see there. Now, to get them off, you want to do this on a piece of paper towel, something soft. I explained this for the petal, but now I'd like to show you it. With acetate, it's a little tricky. You'll see the piece won't just pop off. You want to peel away from the point typically, because if you peel towards it, you're more likely to break it. The other benefit of piping on acetate is you'll have a nice shiny underside, so if that shows in the final construction, that's a boon. That looks terrific. Here's an example of one piped on royal icing. It's a little more rough. We've got everything piped now and dried and ready to be colored, additionally with airbrush coloring. I'm going to start again with the floral elements, the big petals for the big flowers, the smaller folded petals for the emerging flowers or buds, and then the very, very tight fondant buds. Okay, the first step in airbrushing the big petals for the open flower are to use your fingers more or less as the stencil and hit the pointy end to give it a yellow center. Then I'm going to hit the edge with a little bit of electric purple, just the edge. I'm trying to simulate the multicolor Plumeria that we saw earlier. You could use gloves for this step because your hands are obviously in the line of spray, hitting with orange now at the very, very center. However, they're a little clunky, so I prefer to use no gloves. You want to repeat that 4 more times so that each petal looks symmetrical. Make sure you put that purple on the same edge of each petal. Now moving on to the big folded petals for the buds. I'm going to hit the inside with yellow. And I'm going to do the same thing on the tighter petals for the inside of the buds. And I'm hitting with yellow to simulate what the flower would look like if it were to open up to that bigger flower with yellow in the center. And then on the back side, I want to hit each with a little bit of electric purple around the edge. I generally do this from the side so as not to get too much on the body of the petal, but a little variation from piece to piece is not bad. Now for the buds, I'm hitting from the side with just electric purple to accentuate the twist. If I were to come top down, I'd probably conceal more of that twist than I would like. Now let's move on to assembling a bud. I'm using thick white royal icing glue, white because it's less likely to show if a little should peek out, and it's easier to clean off if it does. I'm going to nestle 2 tightly folded petals together to form the interior, and I'm going to add one of the bigger, more open ones that was just pinched on one side to the outside and create a 3-petal bud. You want to make sure that it comes together at a nice tight point at the bottom so that we have a clean contact point with the stem that I'll connect with later. Those look pretty good. A little color variation is great from petal to petal and flower to flower as well. On to airbrushing the green parts. We've got 3 to do: the leaves, the stemlets or spray, and the big stem. Starting first with that, I'm going to hit it from the side with Ameramist Avocado. I generally hit it on the side to which it's curved, as if it's casting a shadow or darker on that side. Now moving on to the stemlets. They're quite fragile. I don't like to pick them up, so I'm going to slide it onto paper towel. You could use a spatula too. This one actually broke, but where it broke is fine because it's going to leave a little more area for that larger flower to the left. You'll see a broken stemlet, one over from the left-hand side. And again, I'm just hitting that from the side with a little bit of avocado, changing out my paper, and moving on to the leaves. I'm hitting the back with avocado. In case that shows in the final construction, make sure you also hit the area where your fingers were holding it. And then I'm going to give it more interest on the upside. I'm going to lay some electric purple down along the vein, like so. Then hit the sides with avocado. I don't want to come from the top with the avocado, I want to leave some of the light underlying green showing because we're going to be painting these leaves as well, and I want the painted veins to really show up and pop. So again, just holding this from the side to hit the edges with the avocado green, and there you have it, a big one and a small one. Now, coming back to paint, I'm using a small fan brush, and I'm dipping it in my same color, avocado airbrush coloring, and I want to try it a few times on paper to make sure I get the hang of it, and make sure I swipe it a few times either on paper towel or paper before putting it on the piece, because you don't want to get too much coloring on the leaf itself. The first brush tends to be heavy on airbrush coloring. That looks good. Again, stroking from the center on out. I don't want to overlap the veins, so you'll notice that I'm moving the brush just far enough so that I'm not painting over veins previously piped. That looks terrific, or previously painted, I should say. And here are a couple of other examples. They look nice and shiny to start. They will dull eventually. We've successfully airbrushed all the pieces that are going to go on the cookie and assembled those that we can. And those that we can were only the buds in this case. In some of my other flower videos, I pre-assemble the whole flower. I haven't in this case, it's worth pointing out, because the petals curve so far back in some circumstances that I can't assemble it on a flat surface and effectively get a knife or something underneath it to get it off that surface and then onto the cookie without breaking off a petal. So we're going to assemble all those petals directly on the cookie. But first we need to decorate the background of the cookie. Because we spent all this time investing in these beautiful flowers to go on top, I want them to really be the dominant statement. So I'm looking for a really subtle suggestion of background pattern. And for that reason, I turned to a stencil, and particularly a mesh stencil. Mesh stencils are different than my conventional stencils that I use in my line, that I produce in my line and use in many of my videos. And I'm going to explain how they're different. Each has pros and cons. So here's a mesh stencil, this big purple thing here. This was designed for cake. And we're just going to section off a piece of it for the cookie. I believe something in this zone here. But what you'll notice is it's like a silk screen. So there is a mesh backing with an opening. The purple part is not open. Anything white is open, and it'll allow color or icing to pass through. And the beauty of mesh stencils is you don't need any line breaks in the stencil to hold the piece together, because the mesh underneath it connects the whole piece. Conversely, on this conventional stencil, similar such leaf, but I've got different break points in here, and here, break points between leaves to keep the stencil held together because there's no mesh supporting the whole thing. So that's kind of a positive of mesh stencils. They can tend to look a little bit more realistic because they're minus all those break points. Some of the negatives are they're not all created equal. Some work horribly. Some do not pass airbrush coloring reliably, nor do they pass royal icing, even with multiple consistencies of royal icing tested. And that, I'm guessing, is largely due to the mesh size they use. If it's too small, it just doesn't allow color to really penetrate. The other thing is most are backed. There's a front side and a back side. I've marked my front here with tape. There's a back side. Typically the back side is reinforced in some way so that you don't get color bleeding through the purple areas where you don't want it. But on some mesh stencils, they're not reinforced so well that you get seepage through into areas you don't want. So they're not all created equal. I've ordered many of these online and have had many not work. I won't name names. I'm working with an Evil Cake Genius stencil, which works really well in terms of no bleeding through, etc. So if you want a really subtle background with airbrushing, a mesh stencil can be nice because you can use the same intensity of coloring straight out of the container without adding white and get a really soft effect. Alternatively, if you don't have a mesh stencil, you can just add a lot of white. Usually I use an alcohol-based white that evaporates very quickly and isn't very watery to dilute those colorings, if you will, to soften the colorings. And I did that recently on my hibiscus video. I used actually the stencil here you see off to the right with diluted food colorings. And just to show you the difference, here's effectively the same palette of colors on this cookie using a traditional stencil. You can see how intense they are. I do have a little extra leaf green on this, but the interior of the leaves are the same exact hues I used over here, and they're just much softer. So those are the pros and cons. And one other con of mesh stencils is they're terrifically expensive. So this stencil might be, I don't recall what it was, maybe 30, 40 bucks. I'll have a link in the video description. Something like this might be $5. So we're going to try to replicate this subtle background in a slightly different orientation on a cookie. And I'll show you how it works. So to airbrush, simply secure the area you want to capture in the stencil genie so that the stencil lays flat, and place it on the cookie. I'm going to just pick up those leaves to the side. I'm hitting first with a little purple down the center of one of the leaves, and then electric green in the others, and then hitting the tips with a little bit of avocado to bring in some of the colors used on the royal icing leaves. And that looks great. Subtle, just as I wanted it. Now I do like to shade the edges to kind of close out the edge of the cookie, and I'm doing this at a greater distance with avocado around the leaf areas, spraying at an angle. I generally locate my spray on the paper towel, so it's good to start with a clean piece of paper towel to locate the spray, and then I roll up the airbrush so it just hits the edge of the cookie. I'm repeating with a light blue on the rest of the cookie edge to simulate sky, and I'm also going to come top down in that white zone and fill it ever so lightly with light blue. The white flowers will pop a little bit more off that light blue. Now it's completely optional to put on additional border. I do like to add a few little dots just to highlight the edges of the cookie. For that I use a beadwork consistency icing. So here are all the elements I could potentially put on the cookie. I like to have multiple things made up in advance so I can kind of puzzle this together. I'm going to start by laying elements down without any icing, and then start committing things to icing once I feel like I've got a pretty good configuration. I am going to keep this one pretty simple, maybe a single stem and spray, possibly a second stem. Okay, so as I noted before, the first step is to sort of lay things out on the cookie to get a general layout, starting with the big pieces, or the anchor pieces, which are the stem in this case. I want to make sure they're located in such a way on the cookie that I have enough room to place buds at the top and the flower at the top. If they're too high, we want to bring those down a little bit to accommodate these pieces. So I should have plenty of room around the stem to accommodate all 5 petals, which is great. So I'm going to start anchoring them down using a little bit of thick white royal icing glue. Again, I prefer to use white in most cases so that if a little peeks out, I can easily clean it up. And to do that, I use a thin liner paintbrush to wipe up any white royal icing. You want to do that quickly so that it doesn't dry onto the cookie. And generally, the fewer areas you glue, the better. 1 or 2 spots on each piece is more than adequate. Now that I've got the stem and stemlets anchored, I'm ready to start affixing the petals around that little stemlet that sits off to the far left. And here I'm primarily just anchoring them in the center, again with a little bit of white royal icing glue. Using my trussing needle to move things around as opposed to my hands. My fingers are a little clunky and are more likely to break things than the trussing needle. So I've got those 5 petals down. I'm ready to start planting buds on top. It's the same sort of pasting process. Now, this additional flower at the bottom is key to locate such that the top petal covers the intersection point between the stem and stemlet, as I've done here. And once you've got that positioned, you can anchor the other 4 petals around it. And then lastly, putting in buds and additional leaves with the same gluing process. You want to make sure that those buds make complete contact with those stems so they look like they're connected. So I'm sliding that forward until such is the case, and repeating with the other 4 buds. Now, the only time I might not use white royal icing glue is when I'm connecting leaves to stems, and in that case I might use matching light green icing as I've done here. That way the white is less likely to show. If any of the green glue is showing, it'll look like it's part of the leaf or stem. So I'm fussing around because I'm not sure which particular buds are going to fit best. That one remaining stem comes pretty close to the cookie edge. Let me get this one down first. And I don't want it to appear too crowded, so perhaps a small bud will be best here. Let's see. Again, moving it into position with my trussing needle is always safer than using my fingers. Let me just anchor that last leaf It was just sitting there loose before with a little light green icing glue. I think that looks pretty good. I don't know. Let me see what a bigger bud looks like on the end. I've shown now how to put down each piece, each done slightly differently. I anchored the leaves with a little bit of green so they blended in with the stem, but everything went down with white otherwise because it's easier to clean off the cookie if I should make a mistake. The only dilemma I've left with is I've got a little bit of white showing in the center of the cookie, and I want to get rid of that by painting some orange airbrush coloring in there with a very fine liner brush. The other issue I have is style-wise. I've got this long extension here. I originally had a tiny bud there, as you saw, but it was looking really, really straight. So I thought maybe a flared, bigger piece might look good there, but now it's coming too close to the edge. I want to play with that a little bit longer, but I don't want to bore you guys with it. The other thing I could do is potentially put another stem up here off to the side, kind of hanging off the cookie and looking kind of artsy. So lots of possibilities, but I'm just going to show you now how to finish off the center. I have airbrush coloring here just because I had it out for other purposes, and it will exactly match what I airbrushed in the centers of the petals before. I'm just kind of dabbing that exposed white icing with it. That'll also kind of heighten the center and provide more interest. You do want to blot the brush before you put it in there so you don't get too much coloring pooling up there, though. I hit the bottom of each petal maybe a little bit too. And I think that's all you need. I'm going to cut now and show you some other finished versions and styles. So with a little more puzzling and pasting, you'll end up with a cookie that looks somewhat like this, or simpler if you just choose a one stem option, or possibly even more complex. In some of the cookies you'll see scrolling overhead, I included additional tropical leaves, which I covered in my recent hibiscus cookie video. You might want to check that out as well for some different leaf options to give the cookie even more variety. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, please check out the other videos in my summer botanical series. Hibiscus and clematis were recently introduced, and poppies are coming very, very soon. And I'd love to see you on my Super Peer platform, so don't forget to check that out in the video description. Until next video, live sweetly.